I want to bring up Taylor Francis, who is the co-founder of Watershed, which is a really impressive, surprisingly impactful. Wait, we can take these away. Hold on. You can sit in one of them. No, over there. Yes, let's just have our thing over here. You sit there. It's a very impactful, surprisingly new company with a lot of incredible customers and backers. Just raised a new round. How big was the round you just raised?
$70 million.
And over $1 billion or $1 billion valuation. So you're a unicorn, but you really only started the company like a year ago, technically. Although you had some customers a little before that, right? So just quickly, Taylor and his two co-founders all worked at Stripe, which we've heard about 4 people on the stage today reference because Stripe made such an early commitment to buying carbon sequestration. Yep. Which Microsoft praised and emulated times 10 because they're a little bit bigger. But you guys decided based on what was happening inside Stripe that you could scale that to be a bigger business, and the two Stripe founder brothers invested. Then you got Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia to back it with John Doerr and Mike Moritz on your board, which is the first time since Google that they've both been on a board together. So this is a pretty cool company. So what are you trying to accomplish?
Well, first of all, it's awesome to be here. What a great gathering today. We're building Watershed to be the software platform that helps companies cut their carbon emissions. And so we help businesses measure where their carbon's coming from, come up with a plan to reduce it, remove whatever remains, and then report on their progress, because it's increasingly becoming kind of a standard part of doing business to report on carbon the same way you report on all your financial results. And we actually got started back in late 2019. And my two co-founders and I had worked at Stripe, spent 5 years building products and businesses and teams at Stripe, and just felt this climate itch and felt like this is a decade to be working on climate, and asked ourselves, what is the thing that we could do that would have the biggest impact on climate? And a couple years later, that's what Watershed is, our attempt at that.
So talk about some of your customers and why they're working with you.
Yeah, so we work with businesses like Airbnb, DoorDash, Twitter, Shopify, Stripe, Sweetgreen, and the apparel industry companies like Everlane and Warby Parker. And I think the thing that they all have in common is that they're trying to go beyond just measuring their carbon graph, and they're trying to figure out some way to bend their carbon graph and actually do something about it. And that takes totally different shapes for different companies. So for Square, now Block, they're thinking a lot about the carbon impact of crypto and Bitcoin and how to drive that ecosystem.
And you help them
clean energy. And we help them understand the impact and understand the leverage. So you've got Bitcoin on one end, and then for Sweetgreen, most of their carbon comes from their food supply chain. It comes from cheese. That's the primary animal product in a Sweetgreen salad. And so we're helping them figure out how to source low carbon blue cheese. So it's kind of Bitcoin to blue cheese and everything in between. And all of these companies are trying to ask, let's go beyond just once a year sustainability report PDF, which is kind of the standard approach on climate for the last 10 years for companies. Let's go beyond that to what are the things our business can actually do differently to get to zero.
Well, as you know, I wrote an article about Watershed at Techonomy, which any of you can read, and it just came out a week or so ago. But one of the fun things I did was I talked to one of your customers, and the interesting thing that the facilities manager for this company, what's it called? It's the company that does it does a lot of content. TaskUs, right? Yeah. Based in Austin no, San Antonio.
Yeah.
Anyway, the TaskUs facilities guy told me that what got them started was that one of their customers came to them and said, "Hey, we're starting to try to figure out our carbon footprint. So what's yours?" And they said, "Well, we don't really know." But so then I guess that company may have been one of your customers, or they at least pointed them in your direction. But what it made me realize was that there's a virtuous cycle that clearly is going to happen here, which is that as companies turn to their whole supply chain and their customer chain, it's going to essentially pull a lot of different players in the same direction.
Yep.
And then you or other companies like you, we've had Persephone on stage, and I want you to talk a little bit about how you see the difference between some of the players. But, you know, you guys can help all those companies work with one another, because they're all going to be testing the impact of all of each other, right? Because they all do business with each other.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of really exciting thing about what's happening with the whole corporate climate movement right now, is that if we get it right, there's going to be this kind of decarbonization cascade, where step one is, you know, SEC is now requiring or suggesting, proposing that public companies report on carbon. This is already happening for basically every business in Europe. There's pressure on investors. You see it from BlackRock and State Street and all the other major investors. The investors put pressure on public companies, and then public companies put pressure on their vendors. And so that's where Taskus ends up kind of enlisted into the climate movement, is because it's a VP of sales who feels like climate is an imperative because carbon is a part of the RFP, it's a part of the quarterly business review. And so, you know, if this goes wrong, what will happen is there's just a bunch of spreadsheets and PDFs that cascade down from each one, you know, from investors to companies to suppliers, and this will just be a bunch of paper that doesn't do anything. If it goes right, you know, there will be this cascade of real carbon action, deploying clean power, electrifying fleets, funding carbon removal, that'll kind of spread from investors to companies to suppliers. I think we can have it go the right way, but that's the big thing that needs to happen over the next few years.
Well, a lot of companies, and particularly the companies in your customer set, are using a lot of cloud stuff, right? We had Microsoft on stage this morning, and really, when Lucas was talking, it is astonishing what they're doing. And it's got to be more than Amazon or Google are doing at this point. I mean, Amazon's got a big climate commitment, but I don't think they've done some of the stuff Microsoft's done. But since everybody's a cloud user, and these are huge, you know, energy consumptive businesses, is that same dynamic going to happen for those giants? In other words, are their customers going to increasingly force them to compete to be the most sustainable cloud?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we're already seeing it where Amazon, Google, and Microsoft are racing to deploy clean power. They're racing to decarbonize their companies. It's awesome. And I think it's driven in large part by demands from their customers. I mean, a lot of our Watershed users see that a huge chunk of their carbon footprint, if they're a tech company, comes from their cloud. And there's a big difference between what instance type and what region and what provider and all the rest. So you're seeing that in the cloud space. I think you're going to see that in every other category, right? We see that Sweetgreen is making the carbon score of its cheese suppliers, its poultry suppliers, its fish suppliers, a key part of deciding who gets renewed as a vendor. And I think you're going to see that in apparel. You're going to see it, you know, Apple is decarbonizing its whole electronic supply chain. So it's a really, really powerful force, and it's happening fast, but it's really hard to get right, because the status quo is that companies kind of, you know, the traditional status quo is companies would only look at the carbon within their four walls, right? What's the energy to heat and cool this building? I'll call that my carbon footprint. I'll buy some offsets. I'll call it a day. The new mode is, let me look at the carbon in my supply chain. Let me actually engage with those suppliers and figure out how to get them to change practices, or how I can shift to a lower carbon option. And that's the thing that's really powerful.
So, well, first of all, anybody have any questions for this guy? Because I got more. Oh, good. Okay. I got more. So, but we have some time. So, can we get the mic over here? Thank you, John.
Hey Taylor, thanks for being here. Nicholas, MBA student from UC Berkeley. My question is, there's, like, if you think about emissions, there's kind of low-hanging fruits, and sometimes even like cost-effective to take some measures to reduce emissions. But then once you go deeper, sometimes you don't even have the technology there to do what you need to do. From your clients and the market in general, how far along do you think we are in, like, there's so much grass to cut, only if we measure and people know what it is they have to do? Or are we deep into the technology?
I think it's very different by industry. So when you work with tech companies, we're talking about deploying clean power. That's a question of when, not if. And I think it's part of why a lot of tech leaders like Amazon and Google have been able to be such leaders on climate, is because there's some low-hanging fruit there. When you get into some companies where their carbon is in heavy manufacturing, it's in cement, those are tricky problems where there's still some kind of technical breakthroughs that we need. I think the important thing is that companies can do both, right? Deploying clean power, engaging your suppliers. There's a playbook for kind of deploying the technologies we've got already. And then what I think Stripe and Shopify and Microsoft are showing on carbon removal, what Apple is showing on low carbon aluminum, is that companies can also bring the future forward by buying at high prices and low volumes the crazy moonshots that we need to be available 10 years from now. Companies are creating a huge, by kind of pointing their dollars in the right direction, companies are pulling that future forward. And so we need them to do both.
And you are big advocates of removal, and you're hoping to bring a lot of your customers along to help finance carbon removal. And if I could just summarize, maybe you can elaborate, but you believe that carbon removal is very expensive now, but if you can have companies essentially invest in it in advance, that will help finance the technology's evolution. So
yeah, and I think carbon removal is an example of a technology that needs to exist at scale 10 to 30 years from now. It's not all of the solution, but it's an important part of the solution. And I mean, two thoughts on this. Number one, companies can pull innovation down the cost curve. They can pull it into the present by kind of sending that demand signal. Thought two is that you're seeing a whole bunch of commitments from companies to be net zero. And the how really matters. There's different ways to kind of like subtract your way down to zero. And our take is that it's really important that companies count all the carbon in their entire supply chain. That's kind of how big the number ought to be, that they first reduce, and that the distance from the max reductions to zero should come from permanent, durable carbon removal, and not some of these kind of traditional avoided emissions offsets. And so that's part of why you're seeing this whole carbon removal space balloon, is that demand signal from companies with that philosophy.
Okay, you are, I think, one of 5 companies here today on stage that do some version of this work. There's Persephone, there's IBM coming up in a minute, there's Microsoft, there's Salesforce. All those companies have some degree of carbon accounting, helping customers. How do you think of the industry you're in? And could you give me a little taxonomy, and particularly how you see yourself in comparison to Persephone?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, hopefully, decarbonization is going to be the huge industry of the next decade. If you think about the propulsive force of the shift to the internet over the last couple decades, we got to cross our fingers that the shift to a low carbon world is going to be an even bigger propulsive force for the next decade, the next 3 decades. I think that means there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of companies to be started. And so I'm really excited about the fact that entrepreneurs, both little startups and garages and huge companies are jumping into this. The big question that, or the big way we've thought about how to design Watershed, is that it's not just enough to measure your emissions. If the goal is to do accounting, do reporting, kind of check the box on what the SEC tells you to do, there's a way to check that box that doesn't take a ton of work, that also doesn't actually reduce your emissions. If you actually want to enable companies to make different choices about their suppliers, if you want to enable companies to make different choices about their products, and enable companies to buy clean power, fund carbon removal, do it in a really high impact way, that's hard. And that's where we're spending a ton of our time, is not just on the accounting and kind of carbon bean counting, but on what are the tools that enable companies to take carbon that's otherwise in the atmosphere and not emit.
Like the carbon removal advocacy, et cetera. So that's the differentiator maybe that you would say for you. But one of the things Suzanne DiBianco from Salesforce just said, and we do have to wrap up, but that they don't really think about competition. Of course, that's probably not true, but I feel particularly in this space, we need to have a big tent approach. I mean, I would love to co-organize conferences with other tech conferences around climate.
Yeah.
Do you think in this industry, obviously you have to compete, but are there key ways that you can collaborate given that the values are so much behind all of these activities?
Yeah, and I think one of the really exciting things is that we need the power of aggregation in this space, right? The more we can aggregate demand from companies for clean power, from companies for carbon removal, the more we can aggregate, Sweetgreen and all of other companies in the food industry, Everlane and other companies in the apparel industry to decarbonize their supply chains together. That's where companies can actually have an impact here. So yeah, I think there's a real power for networks and aggregation and kind of pointing dollars together at the low carbon solution.
Yeah, I'd like to see an industry association of all you companies, but that doesn't exist yet. Anyway, thank you so much. Really good to have you.